Hello and welcome to this video on sulfur-based preservatives. Sulphur is not a new preservative. It has been part of food for centuries, if not millennia. Think of why salami and otherwise preserved meat stays safe. It is down to sulphur and how it prevents the growth of pathogenic bacteria and fungi. This is one of the reasons why we know it has a role. In fact, it has a role going back to ancient Rome, where it's been found in their wine. What has changed is the prevalence, to a degree, over time. It is more common nowadays than it used to be. You would see it listed as something like preservative 220 on food packaging. This is where we get to its role in preserving your homebrew. In theory, you don't need to add a preservative if it is fermented and bottled in a sterile manner. Bottling and good storage should prevent any unwanted pathogenic growth. However, life is rarely, if ever, perfect, and so, if you are cautious, sulphur, and specifically sulfur dioxide, is a legitimate option. On this basis, there is a purpose in using sulphites to preserve brewers' goods. This is more relevant to commercial brewing operations such as mass-produced beer, vineyards making wine, and cider breweries. That does not mean you cannot use it, but there's less need. For most uses of sulfur preservatives, we are talking about sulfur dioxide. This is preservative 220 and has related products, preservatives 221 through to 228. Sulfur dioxide and other sulphites are naturally occurring. That alone deals with the claims that it is unnatural and puts that argument to rest. It's also naturally generated in wine, so yet again another way in which its presence within brewed products is not unnatural. Depending on what country you're in, it may also be a permissible addition for organic produce. This means yet again, you're not going to find it included in a way that is necessarily obvious. As we said earlier, sulfur dioxide and sulphites are naturally occurring, and these are compounds that can form during fermentation, both in wine and beer. Most of what you'll find in wine does occur from the use of additives, but then again there's also a lot that occurs as a result of the fermentation and then aging process, and it can sometimes be difficult to distinguish between them. It is fair to say that the majority, but not necessarily vast majority, comes from additions. Different countries have different allowances. Some allow as much as 400 milligrams per kilogram of wine. It is a roughly 0.04%. This figure is based on the amount of sugar present after fermentation. Others have a lower limit of 250 milligrams or 0.025 for wines that have much less sugar. Some countries have incredibly restrictive laws, and you must have below 100 milligrams per kilogram. Beer is yet again another option, and its rates will vary by country. Some can be as high as 25 milligrams per kilogram, so 0.025. These are the kinds of figures where it can get very messy very quickly, as most countries have their own requirements both domestically and externally. That means whatever's consumed domestically and whatever they're exporting. One thing we can say is that the amount of sulfides in beer, for instance, will be less than what you'd find in wine. One of the reasons for this is simply the amount of sugars in each. Based on that, you would generally find that there's more sulfides in wine, both because of the addition of them and the fermentation process. The takeaway from this is not that it's present, but the important thing is how much you need. It's often quite difficult to get an exact number, and we struggle to find one specifically. We did find an exposure, and that is 2,520 parts per million for an hour. This is based on air levels, so gases, and this is where you find the big catch with sulfides. Ingestion of sulfur dioxide is unlikely to occur. That's because once it's out in the open environment, generally in a wine glass or beer glass, it begins to gas off, even at normal room temperatures. This leaves only tiny amounts still in food and wine, and that's its role as a preservative. And the only people likely to experience a reaction to this are those highly sensitive to it. Asthmatics are notable for this, and they can develop an allergic response. But this is also true of anything else they eat or drink. It's not just wine or beer. It's reasonably safe to say that for most of the population, consuming anything with a sulphite is going to be perfectly fine, and so if you're using it to preserve your own wine or beer at home, you can do so with a fair degree of comfort. The only exception you would need to make is for somebody who is sulphite sensitive, and they're likely to be making this known if you are sharing your own homebrew with them, particularly if it's wine. They're also less likely to consume wine because it already has sulphites present, not only because it occurs as part of the fermentation, but it gets added. This means that they keep a very close eye on what's happening. These are the same people who are also likely to have more care in what they consume because they tend to be more prone to allergies. When you look at sulphites in alcohol compared to just about anything else you would consume, particularly thinking of foods, the concentrations are very low by comparison, and this is an important note. If you are consuming other foods safely, for example, salamis, sausages, and similar preserved goods, if you're not worried about those, you should not be worried about consuming things like wine or beer that have sulphites added. They are otherwise perfectly safe and much safer than anything else you might be consuming. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.